Welcome to the second part of this five-part lecture series on the remarkable history of the Henry George School of Social Science. I am Edward J. Dodson. This second part deals with the Henry George schools beyond New York City and across the United States. Henry Georges in Boston established the school in 1935. The school began operations in this building at 294 Washington Street. Around 160 students completed courses during 1938. John S. Codman, a leader of the Massachusetts Single Tax League, taught and provided teacher training. In 1941, the Henry George Institute took over classes for the Boston Extension, and Harold J. Power was appointed director. At the April 1939 commencement dinner held at the 20th Century Club rooms, the guest speaker was a former member of the New Hampshire legislature, George H. Duncan. Duncan was at the time teaching Henry George's political economy to a group of legislators in Concord, New Hampshire. In 1947, Sanford Farkas was appointed director, and he remained until 1951. He eventually moved to San Francisco, where he became active with the school there. Mitchell Lorio, or Mike as he was called, who had moved to Boston in 1941 from New Jersey and joined the school's faculty in 1944, succeeded Sanford Farkas as director. Mike had received degrees in mathematics from Cornell University. Mitch Channel has served as director of the school for a few years in the early 1980s. He was also elected director of the Incentive Tax League of Massachusetts in 1981. Later in the 1980s, Ernest Kahn was elected president, operating the school's activities out of his home in Sharon, Massachusetts. He died on the 2nd of January 2023. In January of 1989, he wrote to President Bush regarding the cause of the latest financial crisis. The banks invested in real estate through the financing of loans to industry and individuals to purchase real estate when the market for real estate was already very high, and they did not use good judgment in making the loans. This lack of judgment that I call malpractice of the banks is not completely their own doing. This malpractice is the result of our way of looking at real estate loans, which is what savings and loan banks primarily invest in. We tend to think of all real estate as one thing, but it is really two. The land or site is one part, and the improvements are another. He went on to explain to the president the problems caused by the conventional form of real estate taxation, the resulting speculation in land, and how to solve the problem. The last indication of any activity by Ernest Kahn or any others in the Boston area was in 2007, when he and his wife attended the Council of Georgist Organizations conference held at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania. Next to New York City, Chicago in the 1930s still had a large and cohesive Henry George's community. The establishment of the school brought in new members. Chicago Henry George's founded the school in 1934 under the direction of Henry L.T. Tiedemann. In December of 1937, the commencement dinner for the fall term was held for 85 students. The next year, there were 137 graduates from 19 courses taught that autumn. The school had moved in 1938 to this building at 4536 North Ravenswood Avenue. In December of 1938, John Lawrence Monroe joined the staff to take on organization work. In the July-August 1940 issue of Land and Freedom, Monroe reported on the school's activities. A speakers bureau is being formed under the leadership of Mrs. Edith Seibenman and Mrs. Beatrice Ortis to emulate the work of the Speakers Bureau in New York. A motion picture is in process of preparation by a committee of graduates headed by Leonard K. Nitz. The picture will be shown at clubs, employee meetings, etc. for the purpose of securing class enrollments. Then in 1940, the Chicago School moved to the Garrick Building at 64 West Randolph Street. The June 1940 issue of the Freeman reported as follows. Twice as much space is available as at the old address, where the headquarters had been located for the past 15 months. For many years, the old Single-Tax Club had occupied a room in the same building. Yet just 2 years later, the school moved again to space leased from Northwestern University. Nearly 700 students enrolled for the fall 1941 semester. A weekly forum was held at the school by the Henry George Fellowship. One of the speakers was the future U.S. Senator Paul H. Douglas, then an alderman. Douglas earned a Ph.D. in economics at Columbia University in 1921, while on the faculty at the University of Chicago. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1942. In 1971, his memoirs, titled In the Fullness of Time, was published. On pages 445 and 446, he commented on his agreement with Henry George over the problems caused by the failure to tax the unearned increments on bare land values, and explained why he made no attempt while a U.S. Senator to sponsor or back enabling legislation. By the time I was in the Senate, the single-tax movement had slumped since the days of its great advocates. Many economists, by the captious criticisms, had contributed to this debacle. Because of this, and the fact the issue involved local and state governments rather than national, I did not take up this reform. But I am grateful that as chairman of the Commission on Urban Problems, I later had the chance to draft a supplementary statement on the subject and was supported by 3 of my colleagues. When I pass before the great judgment seat, I hope St. Peter may forgive my silence as a senator on the increase in land values and accept my later efforts as at least partial atonement. The main speaker at the Chicago School's annual banquet in 1943 was Robert Maynard Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago. Through his association with the former British MP Francis Neilson, Hutchins was well acquainted with the Henry George's position on taxation. In a 1964 article published in the Los Angeles Times, Hutchins made clear that he supported the shift to the taxation of land values. Taxes should reflect and promote sound public policies. The real property tax, which is the main support of local, municipal, and county governments, reflects and promotes almost every unsound public policy imaginable. The remedy is absurdly simple. It is to take the tax off the improvements and put it on the land. The owner would then be taxed on what the community had done for him by raising the value of his land. He would not be punished for what he had done to build up the community by using his land. At the December 1943 commencement event, 270 students received certificates, the largest number since the founding of the Chicago School. Robert Tiedemann, a former instructor at the Newark, New Jersey School, was now in Chicago, working as a volunteer program director. He served as chair of the meeting. Beginning in 1946, the school began holding what was called Commerce and Industry Dinners and Luncheons, featuring business leaders as speakers. In 1949, John Lawrence Monroe was made director of the Chicago School, and the first Commerce and Industry course was hosted at the Benjamin Electric Manufacturing Company location. From this point on, the school brought roundtable conference methods to firms, clubs, and other organizations. George Menninger became director in 1961, remaining until his death in January 1967. A few years later, Sam Venturella became active with the school, and in 1979 was elected president of the Board of Trustees. In 1993, he provided a brief history of the Chicago program for the Henry George newsletter. The school prospered for some years, achieving a high point in 1948 when some 90 volunteer teachers helped get and service 100 class locations in Chicago and surrounding suburbs. In the ensuing years, the Chicago Henry George School, like other Henry George schools throughout the world, began to experience difficulty in getting and holding students. Efforts to revive the school's activities were made during the mid-60s. Unfortunately, the Illinois tax exemption was allowed to lapse until a new not-for-profit charter was obtained in 1970. Nevertheless, there was in effect a hiatus in the operation of the school from 1950 to 1988. The average age of Georges kept rising while their numbers kept dwindling. Since 1988, the school's task has been to rebuild. In 1986, when I undertook the task of directing the school, I set for myself a goal of finding a candidate to assume direction of the school from among those who completed the 3-course program of study. Not only has such a candidate come forward, but 2 of our board members have come from our current graduates. One of the younger people who found the school was Robert Drake, who came to Chicago in the 1990s. In 2003, he was elected to the Board of Trustees and made Education Director. Then, in 2005, he began work on a modernized version of Henry George's Progress in Poverty. Sadly, he died in May of 2009. 2 other young persons were brought into the school's group of supporters by Sam Venturella in 1989. They were Scott and Sue Walton. Scott was hired as a part-time assistant to Sam, working on the use of public television and radio to reach a wide audience. They co-authored an article titled "Looking Forward" that appeared in the autumn 1996 issue of the Georges Journal. They provided a long list of ideas designed to attract new adherents. Chuck Metalis began his long association with the school in the 1980s. In 1986, he became editor of the Illinois Georges, and in 2002 he was elected a vice president of the school. The next year, he began to teach courses as well. School activities and classes today are held at the Signature Office Center, 333 South Wabash Avenue in room 2700. The Detroit, Michigan area was another logical part of the country for the school to establish an extension. Detroit had grown rapidly as a center of automobile production. In the 1930s, the city's working population was experiencing difficult times, of course. So in Detroit, William J. Palmer organized a class in 1941 in the main library. Granville W. Anderson moved to Detroit from New Jersey and began working with Palmer. Unfortunately, the school became inactive during the Second World War, but was reactivated in 1950 with offices in the Ford Building. Their challenge was much greater now that boom times were returning. In 1948, Robert Benton helped to establish an extension in Columbus, Ohio. 2 years later, he moved to Detroit to take over as director there. His progress was reported in the March 1951 issue of the Henry George News. Robert Benton, newest director, keeps working so quietly and effectively that sometimes we forget to mention him. Dale McGinter, who conducts a program on WJR, interviewed him concerning the school's purpose and class schedule in a 7-minute program on the air. By that time, 14 students had enrolled for the winter session. In 1965, Benton moved the school out of Detroit and operated out of his home in Royal Oak, changing the name to the Michigan Extension. In 1985, he reflected on the decades of effort in both the educational and political arenas. I've heard it said in our movement that we don't have time for the study and that we must get the message to the people before something awful happens. That may create a Messiah, but will it create disciples? Can't we see that both the time frame of concept examination and political action are necessary to reach our goal? Some are better at education and some are better at political action. Robert Benton died in January of 2009 at age 92. Located on Mobile Bay in Alabama, Fairhope had been established early in the 20th century as a land trust community with title to all of the land held by the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation and offered to residents and businesses under a lease subject to annual ground rent payments. Marietta Johnson opened the school in Fairhope in 1907. Offering education to the children of the town free of charge with this objective. It is a demonstration of the principle that education is growth and that the school program to be educational must minister to all-around development and must especially provide conditions for the development of the finest thinking power. This is an early photograph of the faculty of the School of Organic Education. And here is an undated photograph of Marie Holland in the Fairhope Public Library. She was the first librarian in Fairhope. The innovative teaching methods of the school were described by C.A. Gaston to the School District of Riverside, Illinois. This letter is the superintendent's response. The future of the School of Organic Education was reasonably secured as detailed in this open letter sent to supporters in 1946 by a member of the faculty, Robert Calhoun. I'll read just a short excerpt from the letter. Prospects for the coming school year at Organic are brighter than in many years. Our faculty has been expanded, the buildings have been repaired and repainted, work is progressing on a new athletics field, and school spirit is high. This letter to Robert Clancy, director of the Henry George School in New York, indicates that the basic course was about to begin in Fairhope, taught by Lucier Rockwell. In 1963, 34 young people from Fairhope High School and the Organic School of Education took a course on the single tax, part of which was an essay contest. This is a photograph of the winners, their instructors, and several directors of the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation. And today the school thrives. And so we move on to Hartford, Connecticut and its story. A small group of Henry Georges in Hartford joined in the effort as well. Nathan Hillman, an attorney, moved to Hartford from Chicago in the 1930s. He joined with others to start the school in 1936. In 1961, 2 years before his death, he reflected on the difficulty of changing minds in the pages of the Henry George News. The average person from the day he is born is taught to believe in authority. As a child, he is taught to obey his parents and respect the teachers. He leaves college ready to believe that an authority called government can take care of him. Very few of us can accept the idea of standing on our own feet after we have been taught all our lives to rely on others. Therefore, we Georges are rare who stand up to society and say that we can take care of ourselves. All we ask for is freedom and social justice. In 1938, James A. McNally became the volunteer director. In December of that year, a commencement was held for 40 students. 41 students completed the course in 1939 and another 40 in 1940. McNally was appointed director in 1953. This photograph was taken that year in Boston. Joseph Stockman, director of the extension in Philadelphia, is with him. James McNally died in 1961. Considering Nathan Hillman's comments above, the school was probably forced to shut down. The first record of classes organized in Los Angeles is from 1937. At the graduation exercises in October, the guest speaker was William C. DeMille. 12 students completed the course during 1938. The school established headquarters at 304 South Broadway, and Harry H. Farrell was appointed extension secretary. An article on the school appearing in the May 1939 issue of the Freeman reported, according to the report of Harry H. Farrell, Extension Secretary, 40 graduates of previous courses in fundamental economics began the study of international trade on May 9. Mr. Farrell writes, although not yet a 100% Georgist, Dr. Ernest Caldecott is an enthusiastic supporter of our educational work, and we are using the parlor of the First Unitarian Church. William B. Trueheart was appointed director of the school in 1942, strongly supported by Anthony Pratt, director of the Los Angeles Municipal League. In 1943, the school secured space in a building located at 555 North Vermont Avenue. This photograph shows the intersection of Vermont Avenue and Wilshire Boulevard at the time. The details were reported in the September 1945 issue of the Henry George News. Sometime this fall, the Los Angeles office will be moved to larger quarters at 333 North Madison Avenue near Vermont and Beverly. The new headquarters is now being renovated. This move is made possible by the generosity of the late Norma Cooley, editor of Tax Facts, and daughter of Stoughton Cooley. Miss Cooley left her home to the Los Angeles extension of the Henry George School. In 1955, William Trueheart launched a weekly radio program called Events and You. The first program featured an interview of Agnes DeMille. In 1959, he began a radio program titled Economics by George, which lasted 1 year. In 1964, he moved to Dallas, Texas, where he opened an extension of the Henry George School until beginning work on a PhD in economics. In 1965, Harry Pollard came from Toronto, Ontario, to become director of the Los Angeles School. He had his own very special ideas of how best to use education to bring new people into the Henry Georgist community. Harry continuously revised course material to improve its clarity and relevance to what was happening in the real world. He called his program Classical Analysis. And in an effort to reach high school students, he developed a group learning program called Inter-Student. This photograph is of Harry with Brett Barker, one of the many teachers who would bring the Inter-Student program into the classroom. Brett continued to make use of Inter-Student, continuously working with Harry on improvements until his retirement from teaching a few years ago. Another innovation by Harry Pollard was the publication of a magazine titled The Good Society. About this project, he wrote, "A primary purpose of the periodical is the promotion of the high school program. However, this will be accomplished only if The Good Society is read. Therefore, it must be provocative enough to induce reader participation." Harry Pollard continued to teach and write almost to the end of his life, taken in 2020 after contracting the COVID-19 virus. To the end, he remained convinced that only face-to-face education would, quote, produce the knowledgeable people who can get us to the goal and keep us there. Newark, New Jersey was a natural location for an extension of the school. Many of the students who completed courses at the school in New York were New Jersey residents. In 1937, a New Jersey extension was founded by Elizabeth Bowen and George L. Rusby, located at 78 Clinton Avenue in Newark. Then in 1938, the school incorporated and established offices at 744 Broad Street. William L. Hall, a graduate of Princeton University, was elected secretary. However, he soon left to take a faculty position at Franklin Pierce College in New Hampshire. There was one more move before this building at 1114 Broad Street was acquired. Among the early teachers was John T. Tetley, who had completed courses at the New York School between 1935 and 1938. He became an instructor at the Newark School in 1940. In 1948, he became the director and was elected to the school's Board of Trustees. Bowen and Rusby combined to produce a new textbook they titled Economics Simplified, published in 1942. Alexander M. Goldfinger reviewed the book in the November 1942 issue of the Freeman, thanking the authors for providing what he and others were longing for. It is written in simple language and abounds with charts and diagrams. There are 10 chapters or lessons, accommodating the text to the usual 10-week course used by the Henry George School. Dr. Bowen and Mr. Rusby have written a book in which opinions have largely been eliminated, with the possible exception that the proposal of George to change the land tenure system by means of taxation and thus solve the problem of poverty may be considered an undemonstrable opinion. Courses were taught at various locations for the next few years, with Elizabeth Bowen conducting teacher training. In May, 180 students received certificates. This is a photograph of the school's location at 78 Clinton Avenue, acquired in 1957. The New Jersey School moved from Newark in 1968 to East Orange. John Tetley continued on as director. Dr. Jeffrey W. Esty served as president of the Board of Trustees. At some point between then and 1978, courses were discontinued. In the October 1978 issue of the Gargoyle, the school's newsletter, John Tetley explained the situation. The Gargoyle suspends publication with this issue. While this little publication did perhaps publish some information of Georgist activities not otherwise reported, we do not believe it advisable to continue the publication. Since the Henry George School of New Jersey is not actively conducting study groups, the holding of a bulk mailing permit, when used only to send 10 issues of the Gargoyle per year, is rather steep. The Henry George community in Philadelphia remained quite active in the first decades of the 20th century, with many members of the Single Tax Party of Philadelphia still there and involved. The building in Philadelphia where Henry George's family lived during his first years was saved from demolition in 1904 when purchased by the Historical Society. In 1926, the building was purchased by the Henry George Foundation of America and offered for lease to tenants. The Henry George School purchased the building in 1957 and began holding classes there soon after. In 1935, an extension was established in Philadelphia under the direction of Julian Hickok, a mechanical engineer who came to work in Philadelphia in 1916 and eventually taught mathematics in the Philadelphia school system. It was in New York that he first heard about Henry George and the single tax. In Philadelphia, He joined the Single-Tax Party in 1920. In 1926, with the party's name changed to the Commonwealth Land Party, he stood as the party's nominee for governor of Pennsylvania. This is one of the first certificates of completion the school issued to a student. At the 1937 commencement dinner, Dr. Henry George III spoke on, quote, "A lesson from nature." Frank Chodoroff came from New York to participate, speaking on, quote, "The mechanics of idealism." 135 people attended the commencement dinner the next year. In 1942, Joseph Stockman succeeded Julian Hickok as extension director. He had known something of Henry George since his youth through his father's association with Edward McGlynn and the Anti-Poverty Society in New York. He came to the school as a student in 1934 and began teaching not long thereafter. He also traveled to New York to teach classes in Chinese, a language in which he had become fluent. Edwin Ross Jr., whose father was an early trustee of the Georgist enclave near Wilmington, Delaware, known as Arden, had moved to New York in the 1920s to pursue a career in the theater. He served on the advisory committee formed by Oscar Geiger in 1932, and in 1939 was appointed assistant to Chodoroff. A play he co-wrote with Laura Ross, No Sunday for Friday, was performed at the school in June of 1940. The next year, he was transferred to Philadelphia to work for the extension as a field director. His work for the school was short-lived, however. In 1942, he entered military service. This photograph of Joseph Stockman, New York director Robert Clancy, and two unidentified members of the school supporters is from 1963. Stockman's health failed later that year, and he died on the 14th of January 1964. An unsigned remembrance in the February 1964 issue of Henry George News provided some insights into his life and personality. Mr. Stockman, like Henry George, was practically self-taught, and like him too, his alert mind took in a broad canvas. He taught adult education classes at two high schools and was a member of the Educational Council of Philadelphia. Since 1957, he was the beneficent curator and guiding spirit of the birthplace of Henry George. In 1964, longtime volunteer Lou Cipollone was honored for years of dedicated service. Her association with the school began in 1937 and continued until the early 2000s. George Collins emigrated to the United States from Jamaica in 1955 and then spent 4 years in the U.S. Air Force. In 1961, he enrolled in the Henry George School in New York, and by 1963 had began to teach courses himself. He was recruited to succeed Joseph Stockman as the extension director in Philadelphia. Here is George at his desk at the Henry George Birthplace building in 1971. George Collins brought with him to Philadelphia the Socratic method of teaching he learned while in New York. Readings from Henry George's Progress and Poverty were assigned, and students were given a list of questions from each reading to answer and then discuss in class. The basic course, Fundamentals of Economics, comprised 10 weekly sessions. This photograph is of the main classroom on the second floor of the building. Many Henry Georgists visited the birthplace when they came to Philadelphia. In 1979, Agnes DeMille, Henry George's granddaughter, visited. Also in this photograph with Agnes and George Collins is Jack Schwartzman and one person I have not been able to identify. This is how the rear courtyard of the building appeared in the early 1970s. And here is George Collins and Hugh Cipollone with the bust of Henry George in the front room of the birthplace. I came to this school in 1980 as a student, having been introduced to Henry George's ideas about tax reform in the early 1970s by a city planner in central Pennsylvania. After completing the 3-course program, George Collins invited me to join the all-volunteer faculty. These 2 photographs are of a community outreach effort and a school dinner event. This photograph from 1982 includes future Extension Director Richard Biddle, who had joined the faculty in 1979. Richard took over as acting director in 2004. 1989 was an extremely busy year in Philadelphia. The International Conference was held that summer at the University of Pennsylvania. Earlier in the year, the Board of Trustees had approved a major restoration of the birthplace. The work continued right up to the morning this photograph was taken. When George Collins was appointed director of the New York School in 1989, Mike Curtis came in to succeed him in Philadelphia. In the July 1998 issue of Henry George News, Mike reflected on his 25 years of teaching at the school. I've taught many college graduates and more recently some high school students. I've taught recovering drug and alcohol addicts and just plain poor people in the slums. I've taught hundreds and hundreds of prisoners, including armed robbers and murderers. However, without a doubt, 5th and 8th graders have been the most challenging. The situation in New York was not running smoothly. Thomas Smith, who came on as Director of Education after George Collins' retirement, could not devote the time necessary to fulfill the responsibilities of director. Mike Curtis was invited to fill the position, which he did in 2000. Ken Ford, a graduate of Indiana University of Pennsylvania, had majored in history where he learned about Henry George from Professor Stephen Cord. Ken first took courses at the Philadelphia Extension in 1984 and eventually became a volunteer instructor. In 2002, he was appointed Extension Director. In 2004, Dan Sullivan, an activist Georgist in Pittsburgh, was brought in to replace Ken Ford. And a year later, Richard Biddle was hired to fill the position when Dan Sullivan returned to Pittsburgh. Richard, retired from the Philadelphia School District, eventually decided to split his time between Philadelphia and a second home he possessed in California. So in 2010, I agreed to step in until someone else could be found capable of handling the responsibilities. One of our students, Frank Ortiz, expressed interest. Frank had become a volunteer instructor after completing the school's courses in 2010. In 2011, he was hired as a part-time education director. However, the extension position was eliminated in 2012. The Board of Trustees concluded that the cost of advertising and promoting the courses was not justified given the small number of students being enrolled. Soon thereafter, renovation began to convert the birthplace building into a museum and archive center. Historian Alexander Lau was hired to undertake the task of cataloging and organizing the movement archives accumulated over many decades at the birthplace and in New York. I remained in the position of senior researcher to assist with this process. On the 5th of May 2015, the new Henry George Museum and Archive Center was officially opened. Alexander Lau addressed the audience explaining the work accomplished and what was still to be done. One of the speakers that day was New School for Social Research Professor of Economics Edward Nell, a member of the New York School's Board of Trustees. Sometime thereafter, I met former directors Mike Curtis and Richard Biddle, along with Lou Cipollone, to give them a tour of the renovated birthplace building. Alexandra Lau's work at the birthplace building continued even though she relocated to California. Nearly 20,000 historical documents stored in New York were scanned. Alexandra, with my support, began to catalog this material, which she gradually had uploaded to the school's website. In 2017, a decision was made by the Board of Trustees to put the Birthplace building up for sale. The contents were removed to New York. And from Philadelphia in the east of Pennsylvania, we moved to Pittsburgh in the western part of the state and its history in the movement and the school. Founding of the Henry George School in Pittsburgh was announced in the Pittsburgh Press on the 30th of December 1934. Classes began in January of 1935 in the city's Chamber of Commerce building with 60 students enrolled. Richard Howe was the school's first instructor, and he remained director at least into the 1950s. In 1936, the school established an office in the Bakewell building. One of the members of the Henry George Club in Pittsburgh, Fred S. Karn, wrote that during the 1930s he studied Henry George's works under William McNair. I have not found any further details regarding McNair as a teacher. William McNair graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 1903. The next year, he was introduced to Henry George's political economy by Newton Baker, a college friend. In 1907, he was elected district attorney of Allegheny County and began working closely with members of the Henry Georgeist community in Pittsburgh. In 1933, he was elected mayor of Pittsburgh. In 1937 and 1938, U.S. Representative Charles R. Eckert taught the Fundamental Economics course in Beaver, Pennsylvania. In both years, about 20 students completed the course. Eckert was director of the Henry George Club in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. In the 1950s, he was elected president of the Henry George Foundation of America. He died in October of 1959 at age 91. Samuel M. Rex is recorded as teaching during 1939 and 1940. Sometime in the 1950s or early 1960s, he became director. In 1967, the school moved to the McGee Building, which up until 1914 had been the location of McGee Women's Hospital in the Oakland section of Pittsburgh. Samuel Rex died in February 1972. In 1934, George Evans was appointed chairman of the Pittsburgh Housing Committee. He was at the time president of the Henry George Foundation of America. In 1935, he taught the Fundamentals of Economics course using the lesson materials provided by the New York School. He died on the 8th of June, 1945. I have not been able to find any additional information on the school in Pittsburgh. And now we move all the way across the country to the school's location in San Diego, California. San Diego became home to an extension of the school in 1935, with its headquarters located at 1536 7th Avenue. The first class opened in November with an enrollment of 36 students. E.M. Staglin was appointed extension secretary. In 1987, one of the remaining stalwart members of the Henry George community provided a short article on the early history of the school. Before the 1950s, the caretakers of George's Concepts in San Diego were several reliable and responsible people. Some were prominent. There was Superior Court Judge C.N. Andrews and Marine Corps General Joseph Pendleton. They founded the Henry George School in San Diego as a branch of the New York School. Classes in economics were offered to members of the public, with meetings held in public school classrooms. Bessie Trueheart was the first director of the school. Class materials consisted of Progress and Poverty and Socratic questions based on the text. Bessie Trueheart stepped down in 1950, succeeded for 1 year by Ida Reeves. Sidney Evans then became acting director. George Babolat, an assistant professor of economics at San Diego State College, served on the school's advisory board in 1960. In 1959, Robert Andelson was appointed director of the school in San Diego. That year, Sidney Evans secured a new headquarters, the Henry George House, adjacent to San Diego State College. Robert Andelson reported on the effort. The Henry George House was visited by approximately 150 students and 20 faculty members from the college. Challenge, a campus organization devoted to overcoming apathy and privatism among students, met regularly at the house on a weekly basis to discuss social and economic issues. A year later, Andelson completed his PhD in philosophy and shortly thereafter departed to join the faculty at Northland College in Wisconsin. Colonel Arch Gerard was elected president of the school's board of directors in 1961. In 1964, the Henry George House was sold, and new quarters were obtained at 3627 30th Street. Roy Davidson became director, succeeding Cyrus Schoenfield. The next year, there were just 13 completions of the basic course. Sidney Evans thought that a new direction was needed to generate public interest in Georgist ideas, and this resulted in the creation of a new entity, Basic Economic Education, Inc., funded largely by Evans. BEE established its headquarters at 5111 College Avenue. Floyd Morrow, who had completed courses at the school in 1955, became increasingly involved with the activists and eventually was elected president of the Board of Basic Economic Education. After earning degrees in business and law at the University of Texas, Floyd returned to San Diego. In 1963, he became a deputy city attorney, ran for a seat on city council and lost, but succeeded in 1965, serving 3 terms. His advocacy of the public capture of land values cost him support from mainstream Democrats, and he was defeated in 1977. Floyd died on the 3rd of October, 2019. Basic Economic Education's work attracted Jeffrey Smith to its program, and in 1983, he was appointed Director of Education and Projects Coordinator. Jeff concluded that the cause needed a new name. Georgism as an identification has 2 glaring weaknesses. 1, it lauds a man, deservedly, few people have ever heard of, and 2, it focuses on a personality rather than an idea. We look like a hero-worshipping cult of historico-economic trivia buffs. Calling our ideology Geoism leads naturally into dubbing our proposed national umbrella educational group Geo, which could stand for Growth, Ethical, and Organic, or some such thing. With Geo, our name and our aim, Geoism, can be nearly one and the same, simplifying the problem of identification. Issues arose over the direction Floyd Morrow was taking BEE, and he was removed in 1989. BEE was eventually dissolved, and the educational activity in San Diego essentially ended. One of the people who completed the Henry George course at BEE was Alan Ridley, a graduate of Reed College and U.S. International University. During the mid-1980s, Alan taught English at Trident College in Nagoya, Japan, where he managed publication of a condensed version of Progress and Poverty into Japanese. Returning to San Diego, Alan became involved with Common Ground USA and some years ago organized the Foundation for Economic Justice, a major focus of his activist work today. Here, from the Foundation's website, Alan traces the history of this effort. The Foundation for Economic Justice is the fourth iteration of an organization created by General Joseph Pendleton, U.S. Marine Corps, and Superior Court Judge C.N. Andrews. It was called the Single Tax Association of San Diego. The second iteration was the Henry George School of San Diego, based next to San Diego State University. The third iteration was Basic Economic Education, Inc., based in the Linda Vista neighborhood of San Diego. The Foundation for Economic Justice is the fourth and current organization continuing the work started by General Pendleton and Judge Andrews. Moving up the coast from San Diego, we'll take a look at what happened in San Francisco, California. The first mention of courses on Henry George's political economy being offered in San Francisco was in 1938. An article in the December issue of the Freeman was titled "California for Classes," providing a brief description. Noah D. Alper, Secretary of the Tax Relief Association of California, reports that the Central Committee has decided to carry on an educational campaign, particularly the organizing of extension classes of the Henry George School of Social Science. 7 basic courses were started in 1939, taught by Robert A. Hunter, Helen Denby, Helen Wilson, and Jerome Crawford. An advanced course on international trade was taught by Adolphe de Fremery. Helen Denby had moved to Berkeley, California in 1938 from New York to help build the school in San Francisco. She died in 1945. In 1949, Robert Tiedemann came west from Chicago to become executive director in San Francisco of the newly reorganized school. A small office was leased on Kearny Street, eventually moving to 833 Market Street. From this office, Robert Tiedemann organized 5 Bay Area branches, each of which had its own board. By 1974, over 3,500 students reportedly completed the school's basic courses. He stepped down that year to take on the role of running Tiedemann Montessori Schools, Inc. E. Robert Scrofani moved to California in 1953 after graduating from Fordham University. In San Francisco, he taught high school history and in the early 1960s became active with the Henry George School, elected to the board in 1966 and to the office of president in 1969. He remained active with the school until his untimely death in 1992 after being infected by the HIV virus. Mary Cleveland became associated with the school in the early 1970s. In 1975, she was elected president of the board and in that year organized a conference with the theme Urban Growth, Up or Out, together with the Sierra Club and the sponsorship of the Association of Bay Area Governments. Mary, called Polly by almost everyone, graduated Harvard University in 1966 with a BA degree in physics. She then worked on 2 Ralph Nader studies as research director at California Action. In 1972, she began working on a PhD in economics at the University of California, Berkeley, continuing even though she moved to New York. At a 1981 meeting sponsored by the Council of Georgist Organizations, she presented a paper based on her doctoral dissertation titled Consequences and Causes of Unequal Distribution of Wealth. Alana Hartzog was appointed education director in 1980. In 1983, she began working on a Fundamentals of Economics course in Spanish. Posters advertising the course were distributed throughout the city. A presentation titled The Land Question in History was also made at the annual conference of the National Council of Social Studies Teachers. In 1992, she returned to her home state of Pennsylvania and became a staff writer for Public Opinion. Alana continues to pursue the Georgist remedy to our social, economic, and political problems as both an educator and activist. In the fall of 1982, Fred Foldvari became the new president of the Board of Trustees. Eric Moncourt was elected vice president and Wendell Fitzgerald secretary. Sonio Freeman, a CPA who taught many classes for the school, was elected treasurer. In 1984, Wendell took over as president. In 1996, David Geeson was appointed education director for the San Francisco school. These days, he does his educational work from his home in Bernal Heights. In a 2018 interview by the Jewish News of Northern California, he described his interest in the sociology of the Bible. I have always been intrigued by the Jewish prophets. Many of them were upset by the absence of the forgiveness of debt, so they developed a debt forgiveness program, which is spelled out in Leviticus in the account of the Jubilee. David ran for mayor of San Francisco in 2003 as, he states, quote, a gadfly, where at candidate forums, quote, most people were baffled by his Henry Georgist platform. David's teaching moments today occur as he leads groups of visitors around San Francisco, providing them with a unique and insightful experience. In November of 2019, David addressed an audience at the San Francisco Library with a portrayal of Henry George. Cliff Cobb earned a Master of Public Policy degree at the University of California, Berkeley in 1975. After a few years working in Washington, D.C., he spent 2 years teaching English in Japan. Sometime after his return to the United States in California, he came into contact with leading members of the Henry George community. In 1993, he was appointed director of the Sacramento branch of the school. A year later, he was appointed a senior fellow at Redefining Progress. In 2000, he was appointed interim director of the Robert Schockenbach Foundation and was elected to the foundation's board of trustees in 2002. In 2023, Cliff taught a Zoom-based discussion course for the New York School on the macroeconomic analysis of Mason Gaffney, the longtime professor of economics at the Riverside campus of the University of California. Mason died in July of 2020 at age 97. Getting back to the middle of the country, we come to St. Louis, Missouri. In 1939, classes began in St. Louis under the direction of Noah Alper, with 23 students in the assembly hall of the Central Library. William Hofen guided the extension during the war years. Afterward, Noah Alper added to his resume the role of president of the Public Revenue Education Council. He explained his reasoning in an address at the 1949 Henry George Congress. I am sure the ultimate end of education is and must be political action, but it must be preceded by educational action of a broad type. Any political campaign which is not preceded by a campaign to separate land, rent, wealth collecting groups from wages and interest collecting groups cannot be really successful. We must isolate enemy interests. This is done by education. This is the best of politics in our case. Still, Alper strongly supported the independence of the school. I'm a school man, he said. I am sure we would have nothing at all in St. Louis in the way of a Georgist movement were it not for the school. It is our West Point, and an important one. Here he is in 1955 with others at the American Economics Association conference where the St. Louis school was an exhibitor. Noah Alper retired as director in 1954, succeeded by Laurel Swofford. Here are two drawings they made use of in their educational efforts. Laurel reported in 1967 on the community outreach by this school and by the Public Revenue Education Council's president, Noah Alper, and another important asset the Henry Georges enjoyed. The St. Louis Extension is in an enviable position because of its proximity to the University of Missouri, where for many years Harry Gunnison Brown exposed the students in his economics classes to the philosophy that Henry George attempts to teach. Laurel Swofford died on the 23rd of August 1972. I have found no reference to continuation of adult education classes. Noah Alper continued to send materials to colleges, libraries, and the media. Noah continued his educational activism well into his 80s. He died on the 30th of July in 1983 at age 86. Leadership of the Public Revenue Education Council passed on to Stan Frederickson, who remained active for another decade. Stan died on the 31st of October 2010 at age 99. Leading figures of the Henry Georges community decided in 1895 to attempt to build public support in one state for legislation that would result in adoption of the single tax. They chose Delaware. At that time, Delaware had on its books what were called blue laws that prohibited political activities on Sundays. The single tax proponents violated the blue laws, were arrested and put in the Dover, Delaware jail, where they formed the Dover Jail Single Tax Club. In the end, the effort failed, but there remained a core of devoted Henry Georges. The question for them was, what do they do next? In 1900, a sculptor named Frank Stevens and an architect named Will Price raised funds to purchase land near Wilmington, founding the Land Trust Village of Arden. After discovering the existence of Arden in 1992, journalist Henry Weineck described the unique character of a community that was now almost a century old. Will Price laid out the village, devoting nearly half of the land to greens, forests, paths, and roads. He arranged house lots and roads to follow the contours of the land rather than the grid of a draftsman, and knitted the town together by a network of paths and an early example of separating vehicular and pedestrian traffic. One of the earliest structures built for the community was a library. The village's website has a huge collection of photographs of the village and its residents. Not documented is whether there was any formal program to introduce new arrivals to Henry George's principles regarding the rightness of charging residents the full rental value of whatever land they leased from the village. At least one documented effort to teach others was by Henry George's grandson, a physician who entered private practice in Wilmington, Delaware. In 1938, he taught a course he prepared called Sociology for Nurses at St. Francis Hospital. The course used Progress and Poverty as the text and was essentially the same as the course being taught at the Henry George schools. His students consisted of 16 nurses and 3 nuns. He continued teaching throughout the Second World War, reporting in 1943 on his efforts. Fundamental economics classes were started on October 4th, and we are getting key men of the Democratic Party to help us. They are the ones who count and will bring the rank and file with them. I know I am being criticized for making the classes a party program, but I believe we have to work with the tools at hand. Right now, the tool for me to use is the Democratic Party and endeavoring to get this group to push the educational work as a progressive project. Beginning early in 1944 and continuing into 1946, Henry George III wrote a regular opinion column for the Sunday Morning Star paper, published in Wilmington. In 1945, he ran an unsuccessful campaign to be elected mayor of Wilmington. He died on the 16th of May, 1968. Arden, Delaware resident and trustee Mike Curtis began offering courses to inmates at the Smyrna, Delaware Correctional Center in the early 1980s. Interviewed in 1994 by Lindy Davies, Mike explained why he chose to teach people who were in prison. For so many years, I taught middle-class students, most of whom certainly were in favor of a land value tax, but weren't willing to devote any effort to propagating or implementing the idea because they saw no chance of it ever coming into effect. But now that they know how to play the game, they had the money to invest, and they started to invest in real estate. But the prisoners don't have any money to invest, and I thought maybe they would be willing to put some time and effort into the enlightenment process or into legislation. They certainly are a more receptive audience. They have no ego invested in the ownership of land, and they don't try to tell you that poverty is not so bad. Mike was also reaching college students. In 1987, he spoke to a class at Delaware State College studying political reformers of the 19th century. He also talked to 2 classes of University of Delaware students regarding his recent visit to Nicaragua. This is a photograph of one of the many groups of people Mike taught over the decades. There was time after the 2005 Council of Georgist Organizations Conference in Philadelphia for a visit to Mike's home in the historic Land Trust Village of Arden, Delaware. Kai Hayner, then the director of the Henry George School in New York, is at Mike's left. I do not know the identity of the person next to Mike. Richard Biddle, then the acting director at the Philadelphia Extension, is to my right. These days, Mike continues, essentially without support from anyone else, to handle the students who enroll in the correspondence course offered by the Henry George Institute. Through his leadership of the Arden Georgist Guild, lectures and courses on Henry George's political economy are regularly offered to the Arden community. And with that, we've reached the end of part 2 of this 5-part lecture series. Part 3 will cover the school's growth around the world.